How America Doubled in Size, the Louisiana Purchase and the Race for Continental Power, 1492 to 1803. Most people think they know this story. France needed money, so Napoleon sold Louisiana to America, and suddenly the United States stretched from the Atlantic to the Rockies. But that version is almost completely backwards. The real story is far stranger. America didn't buy its way to continental dominance because it was wealthy or powerful. It bought its way there because it was desperate, and because France was in the middle of a catastrophe that has nearly been erased from American history books. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, I'm going to show you the specific moment when America's entire path to superpower status was decided. And it wasn't the Louisiana Purchase itself. It was something that happened 10,000 miles away, on an island neither Thomas Jefferson nor anyone in Congress was really paying attention to. If you've lived through the Cold War era, you understand how geopolitics works through the lens of competition and desperation. This is that same principle, played out across the Atlantic 2 centuries earlier. If you're watching this, I'd love to hear in the comments, what aspect of American territorial expansion surprised you the most when you learned it? And please subscribe. We're mapping out 400 years of expansion and conflict across every decade, and you won't want to miss where this story takes us. Hold on, there's something crucial you need to understand right now before we go any further. This isn't just about real estate and treaties. It's about the forces that made America choose to expand westward at precisely the moment when that expansion became possible. And if you want to understand the mechanisms behind why nations make these territorial moves, the economic pressures, the strategic calculations, the desperation underneath the diplomatic language, our complete historical guide is available in the description and pinned in the comments. That guide breaks down the hidden signals and patterns that drove continental empires to make their biggest moves. It goes much deeper than this video can. Let's start with what most people get wrong about the beginning. When Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, he wasn't looking for America. He was looking for a shortcut to Asia. He believed, genuinely believed, that by sailing west across the Atlantic, he could avoid the long route around Africa and get to the spices, silks, and wealth of the Orient. He failed, but Spain didn't care. They got gold. That was enough. Here's what happened next, and this is the part that shaped everything. Portugal and Spain drew a line across the world map. Everything to the east of that line belonged to Portugal. Everything to the west belonged to Spain. On paper, the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divided the entire planet between two Catholic monarchies. In reality, it meant that Spain claimed the Caribbean, Mexico, Central America, and all of what we now call the American Southwest and Southeast. North America, the cold, forested, seemingly valueless continent that Spain's explorers actually found in 1539, was considered worthless. Worthless. No gold, no silver, no obvious riches. So Spain ignored it. For more than 100 years, the Spanish Empire was too busy extracting wealth from the lands where the gold actually was. This is critical. Spanish indifference to North America created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped the French, the English, and eventually, after they broke free from England, the Americans. The French understood something the Spanish didn't. They realized that North America wasn't worthless because it had no gold. It was strategically invaluable because it contained something more precious than any precious metal, the interior waterways of an entire continent, the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, the Great Lakes. These weren't just geographic features. In the era before railroads, water was commerce, and whoever controlled the water controlled the continent. By 1700, French trappers and traders had built a network of trading posts that stretched from modern-day Quebec down the Mississippi Valley all the way to present-day Louisiana. These weren't settlements of families building farms. These were strategic outposts designed to control the fur trade, the commodity that European nobility wanted most. French furs were currency. They were power, and France had locked up the entire interior of North America. The English colonies on the Atlantic coast, Virginia, Massachusetts, New York, Georgia, and the rest, were hemmed in, literally boxed in by French territory. Spanish territory blocked them to the south. French territory blocked them to the north and west. The American colonies were trapped on a narrow strip of coast watching French merchants get rich off the continent they couldn't access. This is where the competition becomes explicit. The British Parliament in London saw what was happening. They watched the French consolidate control over North American interior, and they made a decision. The American colonies would not remain trapped. The colonies' commercial future depended on westward expansion, and Britain's commercial future depended on its colonies having that access. In 1754, Britain essentially declared war on France over a valley in present-day Pennsylvania. This wasn't really about that valley. It was about proving who would control the framework of continental power. It was about refusing to accept French dominance over the geography that would eventually make North America a source of wealth comparable to the Spanish silver mines. The conflict lasted 9 years. When it ended in 1763, Britain had won, and in winning, Britain acquired something that would reshape world history. All of French North America, Canada, the territory around the Great Lakes, everything north of the Ohio River, everything east of the Mississippi. France was devastated. Not financially, France had other colonies, other sources of wealth. But strategically, France had been locked out of North America. The British now had the framework in place to settle the interior, to exploit the fur trade, to build a continental power base. But here's where the story becomes truly strange. In 1791, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue, the French colony we now call Haiti, revolted. They were a majority of the island's population. They had experienced the absolute worst horrors that the slave system could inflict, and they rose up against it. Most American history textbooks mention this as a footnote. A revolution happened in Haiti. It was brutal. Haiti became independent in 1804. The end. But that footnote contained the entire mechanism that made the Louisiana Purchase possible. Without the Haitian Revolution, without its specific catastrophic consequences for France, America would not have acquired Louisiana. And without Louisiana, America would have been trapped east of the Mississippi forever. Here's what happened. When the Haitian Revolution erupted, France lost one of its most valuable colonies. The colony that had been generating more wealth than all of Spanish America combined. Sugar, coffee, tropical wealth flowing into French ports. Gone. The revolution meant that enslaved people fought back so successfully that French soldiers were crushed. By 1803, Haiti had declared itself independent, the first successful slave revolution in human history, and France could do nothing about it. Napoleon, who had consolidated power in France in 1799, had other problems. He'd planned to rebuild French power in North America by using Louisiana as a base. He wanted to reclaim Saint-Domingue. He wanted to construct a French empire to rival British power across the Atlantic. But Saint-Domingue wasn't reclaimed. The Haitian Revolution made that impossible. Napoleon's armies were exhausted from European wars. He couldn't afford to defend a vast North American territory that would cost him money and soldiers to maintain, especially when his grand vision for rebuilding French Caribbean Empire had just collapsed in Haiti. So, in 1803, Napoleon did something that shocked the world. He offered to sell Louisiana to the United States. Not a small piece, the entire territory. Roughly 828.0 thousand square miles, doubling the size of the United States overnight. But here's the crucial part that gets left out of most versions of this story. America couldn't actually afford to buy Louisiana. The United States in 1803 was still a fragile nation, barely 2 decades old. Its government had limited revenue, limited credit, limited standing in international finance. So who funded it? Britain did. British banks understood what was happening. If France kept Louisiana, Britain's North American colonies would be competing with French power. If America bought Louisiana with British credit, then Britain's commercial partner, an independent but still aligned English-speaking nation, would control the continent instead. This is the secret I promised at the beginning. America didn't rise to continental power because it was smart or strong or especially ambitious. It rose because of cascading geopolitical catastrophes that nobody in Washington fully understood. The Haitian Revolution destroyed French power in the Caribbean. That destruction forced Napoleon to abandon his North American dreams. His abandonment created an opening. British finance seized that opening because it served British interests to have American rather than French power dominating North America. And America, almost by accident, got handed the keys to a continent. The story of continental America isn't the story of manifest destiny or American exceptionalism. It's the story of how revolutions, financial networks, and great power calculation converged to hand a young nation something it couldn't have possibly seized on its own strength. And that's just the beginning of the expansion story. The ink on those purchase papers was barely dry when Americans realized what they'd actually acquired. $15 million bought them not just the Mississippi River Valley, but an entire continent's worth of unknowns. What was actually out there? Nobody knew. The maps were blank. The rivers were unmapped. The peoples who lived on those lands had their own nations, their own governments, their own centuries of history that American law had absolutely no claim over. President Thomas Jefferson had a solution. He would send explorers west to catalog everything: the geography, the resources, the animals, the peoples. In 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark departed from St. Louis with a small expedition team. They would spend 2.5 years traveling nearly 8,000 miles up the Missouri River, over the Rocky Mountains, and down to the Pacific coast. When they returned in 1806, they brought back journals filled with observations that would reshape American understanding of what they'd purchased. But here's the part that transforms this story from a real estate deal into something far more consequential. The Lewis and Clark expedition wasn't purely scientific. It was imperial reconnaissance. Jefferson sent them west to establish American claims over territories, to map out future settlement patterns, to understand where American colonial power could be extended. The expedition was part exploration, part assertion of sovereignty over lands that France had sold them on paper, but that Native American nations actually controlled in practice. This is where the story splits into two parallel tracks. On one track, American settlement would begin moving westward almost immediately. Settlers poured into Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee throughout the early 1800s. They built farms, towns, and trading posts. They wanted land, lots of it, and the government was willing to sell it to them, often in massive tracts at prices that made speculation irresistible. Fortunes were made overnight by land speculators who bought vast territories, subdivided them, and sold them to incoming settlers at enormous markups. On the other track, the peoples who had lived on those lands for thousands of years faced a choice they hadn't made themselves. They could resist the American expansion, which meant military conflict with a nation that had both numerical superiority and increasingly advanced weaponry, or they could negotiate with American officials for treaties that would attempt to define boundaries between Indian territories and American settlement zones. Neither option was good. Both guaranteed that the world these nations had known was ending. Between 1804 and 1820, the federal government negotiated roughly 50 treaties with Indian nations. Each treaty attempted to define what lands would be reserved for Native Americans and what lands would open to American settlement. But here's the critical detail. These treaties were negotiated from a position where American military capacity was expanding and Native American capacity to resist was shrinking. Diseases, particularly smallpox, had devastated indigenous populations for nearly 2 centuries. The fur trade, which had enriched certain tribes and reshaped trade hierarchies across North America, was beginning to deplete beaver stocks. Competition between tribes for access to remaining resources was intensifying. American expansion wasn't a bulldozer flattening everything in its path. It was slower, more calculated, more legalistic. Treaties created the appearance of consent. Native American leaders signed documents they believed would protect their people's futures. American officials signed the same documents knowing they intended to break them within a generation. Wait, I need you to understand something crucial before we move forward. The mechanisms driving this expansion, the legal frameworks being constructed to justify it, and the economic incentives pulling settlers westward, these aren't accidental details. They're the foundation of how America would actually become continental. Our comprehensive guide on this entire era, which breaks down the specific financial strategies, the political calculations, and the structural forces that made westward expansion inevitable, is available in the description and in the pinned comment. It goes much deeper than I can in these few minutes, revealing the actual levers of power that shaped this period. If you want to truly understand how a young nation became a continental superpower, that guide is where you'll find those answers. By 1820, American settlers had begun pouring into Missouri and Arkansas. The cotton economy, which had become central to American prosperity, was expanding southward and westward. Cotton required land and labor. Land could be acquired from Native Americans through treaties or, increasingly, through simple displacement. Labor was being supplied by the African slave trade, a commerce that was technically illegal but practically tolerated by federal authorities who understood that the Southern economy depended on it. This is crucial. The Louisiana Purchase didn't just double American territory. It transformed what Americans believed was possible. Suddenly, the continent wasn't a limit, it was a destination. Fortunes could be made from land itself, not just from what the land could produce, but from the simple fact of acquiring territory, subdividing it, and selling it forward at higher prices. This land speculation became one of the primary engines of American economic growth in the early 19th century. The federal government created tools to facilitate this process. The Land Ordinance of 1785 had already established how federal lands would be surveyed and sold. But after the Louisiana Purchase, the government accelerated the pace. It offered credit terms to settlers who wanted to buy land directly from the government. It reduced the minimum acreage you had to purchase. It lowered prices to compete with private land speculators. The result was explosive settlement growth. Between 1800 and 1820, the population west of the Appalachian Mountains exploded from roughly 100,000 people to over 2 million. That's a 20-fold increase in 2 decades. Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio transformed from frontier regions into settled states with established economies and political representation. These new populations demanded something from the federal government: protection of their property rights and military assistance against Native American resistance. The War of 1812 changed the dynamics of expansion in ways that most Americans don't fully appreciate. When the United States fought Britain in that conflict, Native American nations tried to form alliances with the British to resist American expansion. Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader, attempted to unite tribes across the continent to present a unified resistance to American settlement. For a moment, it looked like this alliance might actually check American expansion. It didn't. The American army, under generals like Andrew Jackson, defeated these tribal alliances. When the war ended in 1815, the British withdrew their support from Native American nations. The military threat to American expansion had been neutralized. From that point forward, westward expansion faced no organized military opposition that the American government couldn't overcome. What happened next was the removal policies of the 1820s and 1830s. Tribes that had signed treaties supposedly guaranteeing their lands were informed that those lands were now wanted by American settlers. The government offered a choice: accept removal to territories west of the Mississippi River or face forced eviction. Thousands of Native Americans, including the Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw nations, were forced to relocate to Oklahoma and Kansas. The journey, particularly the Cherokee Trail of Tears in 1838 to 1839, resulted in thousands of deaths from disease, starvation, and exposure. This wasn't chaos or accident, it was policy. Federal law authorized it, presidents supported it, generals executed it. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson, made removal official policy. It gave the federal government the authority to designate lands west of the Mississippi as Indian Territory and to compel tribes to relocate there. In exchange, tribes were promised perpetual ownership of those western lands. Those promises meant nothing. Within a few decades, as American settlement pushed past the Mississippi and into the Great Plains, even those western territories would become desirable. The cycle would repeat: new treaties, new promises, new removals. The Louisiana Purchase had handed America a continent. Federal policy ensured that every inch of that continent would eventually be seized. By 1850, the United States had stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The expansion had been driven by multiple forces: speculation, slavery, military conquest, and the systematic displacement of the peoples who actually held those lands. The Louisiana Purchase, the single transaction of 1803, had provided the legal foundation for all of it. And now, let me return to the secret I promised you at the beginning of this video. You remember, I said that America's rise to global dominance seemed almost accidental, that the outcomes we take for granted today were far from inevitable. Here is the truth. The Louisiana Purchase was never really about the land itself. It was about timing, desperation, and a single man's miscalculation on the other side of the Atlantic. Napoleon believed he could rebuild a French empire in North America. He had already lost Haiti to a slave rebellion. He knew that Britain controlled the seas. He knew that the United States was growing restless under French trade restrictions. And yet, he still thought he could hold on to Louisiana as a strategic stronghold from which to project French power across a continent. He was wrong. His miscalculation, his conviction that he could maintain control over lands he could not defend, created the single largest opportunity in American history. When he finally accepted that Louisiana was indefensible, he did not simply hand it back to Spain. He sold it. And he sold it cheaply, because he needed the money for his wars in Europe far more than he needed an empire he could not keep. Jefferson did not engineer this purchase through military genius or diplomatic brilliance. He accepted an offer that Napoleon made. And in doing so, almost without realizing the full scope of what he was acquiring, he doubled the territory of the United States. He gave Americans legal claim to the Mississippi River, to the Missouri River, to the prairies and the mountains and the valleys that lay beyond the horizon. He gave slavery 1,000 new places to spread. He gave land speculators wealth beyond measure. He gave the federal government a justification for removing thousands of native peoples from their ancestral homes. And he set in motion the events that would lead, eventually, to civil war. This is what I mean when I say that America's expansion was not inevitable. It depended on a French general's strategic failure. It depended on the specific economic pressures Napoleon faced in 1803. It depended on luck, on circumstance, on forces that had nothing to do with American virtue or American design. The United States did not seize this territory. It purchased it from a man who needed money more than he needed empire. And in that single transaction, the foundation for American continental dominance was laid. But here is the second part of the secret, and it is equally important. The Louisiana Purchase did not simply hand America a continent. It handed America a choice. Settlers could move west. Speculators could claim land. The federal government could build roads and forts and towns. But what would America do with these new lands? Would it extend the freedom and the democratic experiment that the founding documents promised? Or would it extend the system of slavery that had already taken root in the South? For the next 60 years, this question would tear the nation apart. Every new purchase, every new state, every new election was fought over the same fundamental question. Would the Western territories be open to slavery or closed to it? The Louisiana Purchase was not the end of American expansion. It was the beginning of a crisis that would not be resolved until 1865, with a civil war that killed over 600,000 Americans. The purchase that seemed to promise unlimited growth and unlimited possibility contained, in fact, the seeds of the nation's deepest internal conflict. And yet, by 1865, when the war ended, America had indeed stretched from Atlantic to Pacific. The Louisiana Purchase territory had been fully incorporated, divided, settled, and fought over. The promises and the horrors that it contained had both been realized. Slavery had been abolished, the native peoples had been largely removed or destroyed. The eastern seaboard civilization had extended its reach all the way to the Pacific Ocean. America had doubled in size once, through purchase. It would expand again through war, in Texas, in California, across the Southwest, and each expansion carried with it the same fundamental conflicts that the Louisiana Purchase had planted. This is the secret I promised you. The American continental dominance that seems so natural, so inevitable today. It was built on a single transaction that no one in 1803 fully understood or intended. Napoleon's miscalculation became America's opportunity. And that opportunity became the foundation for everything that followed: the wealth, the power, the conflicts, the growth, and the profound moral reckoning that shaped the nation for the next 2 centuries. The Louisiana Purchase was not simply a real estate transaction. It was a moment when the future of North America was redirected, when one man's failure created another nation's possibility. It was the instant when America stopped being a collection of coastal settlements and became a continental power. And it happened not because of American strength, but because of French weakness. The key takeaway is this: the largest territorial expansion in American history was not seized by force or earned through negotiation. It was purchased from a desperate man by a nation that did not fully comprehend what it was buying. And everything that followed, the westward migration, the slavery expansion, the Civil War, the continental dominance that defines America to this day, flows directly from that single moment of inadvertent genius. Take time this week to consider what major events in your own life seem to hinge on circumstance, on someone else's mistake or desperation, rather than on your own planning. The Louisiana Purchase reminds us that history is rarely as intentional as it appears in retrospect. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey, from Columbus to Jefferson, from the divided world of 1492 to the continental nation of 1803 and beyond. If this deep dive into how America really came to dominate a continent resonated with you, please subscribe to Cold War Clarity so you never miss another episode that challenges the easy versions of history with the complicated truth. Leave a comment below and tell me what surprised you most about this story. I read every single one and genuinely want to know what landed with you. And if you want to go much deeper into the mechanisms and the hidden patterns that drove this expansion, grab our complete guide from the pinned comment or the description. Thank you again, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you're always first to know when we upload. See you next time. End of Part 3. Script complete.